Teaching tips. Teaching tip number 1, be organized if lecturing, put a short outline on the board or give handouts of the lecture. Check off topics on the board as you go through the lecture. Students will be reminded throughout the class period of where you have been and where you are going. Teaching tip number 2, make a list. Make a list of the favorite practices of your past teachers that helped you to learn. Make another list of your least favorite practices of your past teachers. Do the former and avoid the latter unless it will help the teaching process to bring in some of the unpleasant practices. Teaching tip number 3, on fear. Use fear sparingly. You might get students to study harder, but you might scare them away or cause them to give up too soon. It does not hurt to warn the class that a final exam will be harder than previous examinations. Sometimes mentioning difficulty will get their attention and help them resolve to conquer the material. Let them know that it's not you against the students, but you and the students against the material. Teaching tip number 4, on grading. Return papers as soon as possible. I try to return exams the next class period or post-exam results in a timely manner. You will not save any time by putting off grading. You might even save time by avoiding having students coming by and asking about their grade. If you put off grading exams, you might send the message that exams are not important or that the students should not be concerned. Teaching tip number 5, make it worth something. Make it worth something if you want them to do it. Even the best students will not bother to keep a lab notebook or a journal if they don't think you will collect them, read them, or reward them with a few points. Teaching tip number 6, don't fear silence. Students will eventually talk. While we may think the silence is long, students need time to process your questions and to come up with answers. Give them a chance to think and they will eventually talk. In fact, you may want to silently count slowly to 10 or 15 to force yourself to wait enough time for students to think and respond. Teaching tip number 7, sample quizzes and tests. Provide students with sample quizzes and tests. Students can then become familiar with your style of asking questions and testing formats. Teaching tip number 8, get feedback from your students periodically during the semester, especially at the end of a class in which much has happened. Take 5 minutes to have students, anonymously, fill out index cards answering the following question: what's the most significant thing you heard or the most significant thing that happened in class today? Let students know that this doesn't just mean something that the instructor has said or done. The response could address any aspect of the class. Complete a card answering the question yourself. Later, read through all the responses, select one or more that are provocative enough to be useful in subsequent classes, then read them aloud, discuss the issues they raise, etc. Even if you're unable to use one or more responses to follow up directly, these provide a good snapshot assessment of what's happening for students. Their choices are almost always very diverse, and, not surprisingly, very different from what I have chosen as most significant. Inevitably, this exercise acts as a rudder to move my teaching and learning closer to the learning of the students. Teaching tip number 9, be clear. Make sure your syllabus is very clear about how student grades will be calculated. Designate the percentages for each assignment, how much weight you will give each assignment, and what your expectations for each assignment are. Teaching tip number 10, admit when you don't know. Be willing to admit you don't know an answer or tell the students you'll look something up and get back to them. This can promote ongoing learning. Be sure to remember to get back with them on the answer. Teaching tip number 11, remember to review. Begin each class session with a 5-minute interactive review of the concepts dealt with in the previous class session. Get students involved with the content. Teaching tip number 12, use real-world examples. Use practical, real-world analogies to bridge the gaps between something students understand and new concepts you are trying to teach. Teaching tip number 13, vary presentation style. Try not to lecture for more than 20 minutes at a time. Break up your classes with other presentation techniques, group activities, videotapes, discussion, etc. Teaching tip number 14, use students' names. Try to address students by name during teaching sessions. Learn as many as you can and work on the rest. Teaching tip number 15, small group discussions. Involve students in small group discussions and have them share important points through graphic organizers and concept maps. Teaching tip number 16, encourage students' learning strategies. Encourage students to use specific learning strategies by helping them to define their learning tasks, teaching them ways to organize their notes and class resources, teaching students about learning devices that may work in your discipline, mnemonic devices, concept maps, study diaries, etc., modeling cognitive strategies, think aloud while demonstrating problem solving, admit when you don't know something and outline how you'd find out, etc. Teaching tip number 17. Provide examples. Show your students examples of both good work and poor work from previous classes. Teaching tip number 18. Help students review and study list and submit review questions and divide the students into small groups to discuss and provide group answers and solutions. Ask groups to talk about their different answers, if they have them, and to determine a correct answer. Teaching tip number 19. Outline criteria. Outline your assessment criteria. Outline how you grade, what your expectations are, and what criteria you will use for grades early on. While most of us list these things in a syllabus, be sure to point out your expectations to the students early on and be as clear as you can about what criteria constitutes A, B, C, D, etc. work. Teaching tip number 20. Listen to what students have to say. Tell and show your students you care about what they have to say. Don't cut them off, belittle their comments, etc., or soon they will learn not to participate, ask questions, etc. Teaching tip number 21. Add variety to the classroom. Vary your teaching style, lecture, provide group activities, conduct discussion groups, and plan for other teaching styles to capture all of your students into your content and discipline. Teaching tip number 22. Be enthusiastic. Be enthusiastic. Come into your class dragging, and chances are your class will drag. Be enthusiastic about your topic and your class will catch that enthusiasm. Try to convey your love of your discipline to your students. Teaching tip number 23. Keep students informed regularly. Update students on the progress of the course and the semester, where you are in the syllabus, where they are in their knowledge and skills. Relate where students are now with where they've been and where they are going. Teaching tip number 24. Don't forget to review before each lecture. I read over notes and gather my thoughts, no matter how familiar with the material. Every so often, I will think about a new way of teaching a particular topic or a new example to use. Even if I can't think of an improvement for my presentation, reading the material helps make the classroom presentation flow so that I'm not just following my notes. Teaching tip number 25. Start on time. Don't let minds drift or conversations begin. Begin on time and plan activities that take the entire class period, especially at the beginning of the semester. Don't let students even begin to think that you don't value your time in class by cutting class short or letting them out early. If you require attendance of your students, please consider your actions as well. If you require students to be there on time, you need to be on time as well. Teaching tip number 26. Watch for boredom. You might lose some of your students no matter what the topic, what the hour, or which day of the week you teach. But, if too many tune out, you should consider changing something. It might be as simple as changing the volume of your voice, or the pace you talk. You might begin to include interesting stories or anecdotes related to the classroom material. Teaching tip number 27. Promote student success. At the beginning of each class period, select a student to give a short summary of the main points of the last class. This can help students who might have missed the last class and can help you understand what the students see as important. In addition, it can help students work on their oral communication skills. Teaching tip number 28. Help your students learn. Think about ways that you can help your students set short-term academic goals, ones that are challenging, but attainable. For example, you might review some goals with a class that will be met over the next couple of weeks. After you have done that, ask your students to set their own goals dealing with a particular content area. The students could then outline what they need to do to meet those goals and identify what resources they need from you to help them meet those goals. By helping students realize what they do to control their own learning, you can help students begin to take responsibility for their own learning. Teaching tip number 29. 1-minute papers. These quick, short bits of writing can help students check what they know. Cut 8.5 x 11 sheets of paper into quarters. Hand out paper slips to your students or ask them to pick them up as they come into the classroom. Ask students to write an answer to a question about the content, lecture, or chapter for 1 minute. Yes, time them. Collect the papers for review or ask students to review each other's answers and discuss. If you want, you can just use this method as a quick way to check student attendance. You don't need to tell students whether or not the papers will be graded until after you collect the papers. Teaching tip number 30. Demonstrate enthusiasm for your discipline. Are you a teacher that makes things happen, watches what happens, or asks, "What happened?" Enthusiasm about a subject matter, or a lack of such, is catching. If you're not enjoying your time in the classroom, your students won't either. And, as far as I know, fun is not the opposite of hard. So, you can be enthusiastic and having fun, while still challenging the students to think. Teaching tip number 31. Pictures and images. A picture is worth thousands. Ask students to draw pictures of their mental understanding of a topic or a concept. This is a great way for students to synthesize material and to visualize it in relation to other concepts. You might ask them to share their drawing with a classmate as a way to begin discussion on a topic. Teaching tip number 32. Student feedback can help you improve your teaching. Here are some questions you might want to ask your students to get a feel for how the class is going. What I usually do is give the students index cards and ask them to label each side, point 1 and 2. Then give the students 3 to 5 minutes to answer the following questions. They do not have to put their names on the cards. I usually time the process 3 to 5 minutes. Questions to ask. What do you think of the class so far? If you were the professor, what would you do differently? Teaching tip number 33. Ask questions frequently. Ask questions frequently during each class. Students will think if you make them do so. Try to make your questions thought-provoking. Try to ask open-ended questions, questions that may not have a single answer. Stay away from closed-ended questions, questions that can be answered with a simple, regurgitated answer, or a yes or no. Be patient when waiting for answers. Count to 5 or 10 slowly to yourself. If you answer your own question, then students will learn to let you do so always. Give your students time to think before they answer the question. Teaching tip number 34. Ask for student questions. Ask students to create the test questions. Ask students to submit test questions to you. Allow all of the questions submitted to be viewed by the students as a study tool. Pool all the questions and select questions from the list for your test. You might also want to discuss some of the good questions versus poor questions from those that are submitted. This can also prompt a discussion of higher levels thinking. Teaching tip number 35. Cool website to increase vocabulary. This website is so cool. If you type in a word, several words appear with similar meanings. You can then click on any of those to get even more words. Teaching tip number 36. Start each class with specific goals and objectives in mind. Plan specific educational goals and objectives for each class that relate to your overall goals and objectives. These should be directly related to what the students will learn in each class, not what you will presenting each class. Develop your goals and objectives around a variety of activities, demonstrations, experiential activities, specific critical thinking skills, writing skills, attitudes and values, etc., or the personal implications found in the course content. Teaching tip number 37. Asking questions. Ask only questions that will give you an idea of what the student is learning. Avoid wasteful questions like, "Does everyone understand?" "Are there any questions?" or "Is that concept clear?" Replace these with questions like, "What is your understanding of?" "Can you explain the concept of XXX in your own words?" "What is the relationship between concept X and concept Y? Why do you think so?" Plan out questions for each class session. Think about including higher order question like, "What evidence is there for X?" or "What important information is missing from Y?" Teaching tip number 38. Teach more, better. Don't overwhelm your students with your whole knowledge base. Focus on the course content and objectives. Spend more time on reinforcing those goals and objectives for the students who may have had little background in the course content area. By not overwhelming the students, their long-term retention of the content should go up. Teaching tip number 39. First days, opening days, getting students excited about your course. It's the first day of class. How many of your students come? How many of your students expect to be given the syllabus and then get to leave early? What message are you sending by not taking this first opportunity to get your students pumped up about your course? Try to plan a fun activity that exposes the students to the content discipline right off the bat. You might consider asking them to list ways in which the content can be useful to them in future careers or in their current daily life. You might ask them to solve some problems, which would also give you a sense of where they are in their current knowledge and skill. Think of ways to use the time to give the students the message that coming to class is important because they will do things that are not covered in the text and that help them make sense of the class content. Yes, you might review the syllabus, but you might also consider doing this last, just before the class period is over. Teaching tip number 40: encouraging contact between students and faculty. Good practice in undergraduate education. Encourages contact between students and faculty. Some ways to do this: advise your students, not just advisees, about career opportunities in your field, share past experiences, attitudes and values with your students, attend events sponsored by student groups, know your students by name by the end of the second week of the term, make an effort to be available for your students outside of class, serve as a mentor or informal advisor to students. Teaching tip number 41: stimulate classroom discussion. Get those discussions started by beginning class with a discussion of an issue of the day. Discussions can last for 10 to 15 minutes and can revolve around issues of the field or discipline, an issue from current events as it relates to your course content, or a generic campus issue. Teaching tip number 42: good practice in undergraduate education. Encourages active learning. Ways to do this: ask students to present their work in class, ask students to summarize similarities and differences of theories, research, etc. as they relate to your discipline, ask students to relate outside experiences to the course content, ask students to undertake research or independent study, encourage students to challenge your ideas, the ideas of other students, or those ideas presented in the reading material or other course material, give students concrete, real-life situations to analyze, use simulations, role-playing or labs as a part of your classes, encourage students to suggest new readings, research projects, field trips, etc. that relate to the course content, arrange field trips, internships, etc. for students, carry out research projects with students.